So here we go. So first introduction, just some commonalities, similarities and differences between Girard and Stiegler. I think the commonalities include at least the following. Both were deeply influenced by Catholic Christianity. Both offer an account of human cultural evolution. Both were sharply focused on the role of desire in human society, especially in modernity. Both wrote about the pharmakon, albeit of course with different emphasis, Girard stressing the pharmakos as scapegoat and Stiegler focusing more on the pharmakon as both poison and cure. And both, interestingly enough, were increasingly apocalyptic in their later writings. So I work on the assumption that the majority of attendants are more familiar with Girard than with Stiegler. So I'm going to say first a bit more on Stiegler and the rest of this first section. First then is Catholic influence. While the Catholicism of his youth, to which Girard converted in his mid-30s, was to a large extent the framework, of course, from which he thought about concepts like religion, violence, mimesis, scapegoat, desire, and the apocalypse, the Catholic influence on Stiegler's thought was more indirect. Although he grew up in a secular home and became involved with the French Communist Party around the age of 16 in the 68 student and worker revolts in France, and although he was an avowed atheist, he was, by his own admission, deeply influenced by his one very pious Catholic grandmother. Although he probably, due to his Heideggerian and Derridian influences, rather uncritically accepted the problematic concept of ontotheology in reference to Christianity, he often wrote quite sympathetically about religious believers in general and French Catholics in particular. The Catholic influence on Stiegler is also, and more importantly, visible in his extensive reworking of Christian concepts such as the fall, belief, hope, the diabolical, community, the resurrection, and liturgy. This led me to argue elsewhere that just like Stiegler stated in Technics and Time, Volume 1, that technics is life lived through means other than life, his project in key regards, I think, can be described as Catholicism pursued through other means than Catholicism itself, about which I'll say a bit more when I discuss his book on automatic society. In 1.2, briefly about human cultural evolution. While Girard saw religion as the key driver in human cultural evolution, Stiegler, following the French paleoanthropologist André Leroy-Gourhan, 1911 to 1986, saw techniques and technical development as the key driver in human cultural evolution. In this regard, combining their views on human cultural evolution may be a very insightful exercise, but it has to be noted that Stiegler's strong emphasis on techniques and technological development, in my view, led him to a technocentric position in which he did not give sufficient account of the role of religion in human cultural evolution, especially in the history of the West from the ancient Greeks to modernity, that he focused a lot on. In my own work on Stiegler, I've argued that drawing on liturgical Christianity and its philosophy and theology is the appropriate means to correct Stiegler's technocentrism while losing none of his invaluable acute analysis of the challenges of contemporary technology. In my conclusion below, I shall attempt to demonstrate this very briefly in regards to his analysis of the automatic society. In 1.3, desire, both Girard and Stiegler wrote extensively on the role of desire in human culture and politics. While they both agree that desire is a key force in human culture and politics, they approach desire from two very different paradigms. That is, to use Girard's terminology in the English translation of his first book, while Girard has a novelistic view of desire, as sourced from the model of the desiring subject, Stiegler arguably has a romantic view of desire, perhaps I'm contentious here, as unique to each desiring subject, and he remained deeply influenced by the Freudian account of the object of desire. For Stiegler, desire is very much a force of its own, investing the world with objects of desire through projection. This brings us to the end of this very basic comparative introduction to Stiegler and Girard, and I'll now go on immediately to look at the Girardian perspective of how Stiegler reads and applies these and other concepts to artificial intelligence and automation. Now, in order to make sense of Stiegler's analysis of what he calls the automatic society, that is a society where processes of production, data management and the spread of knowledge and information are increasingly automatized, it's necessary to bear three things in mind. First is his concept of industrialization. Secondly, his concept of performativity beyond consciousness. And thirdly, his commitment to Kant's concept of reason and the broader late 18th century project of Franco-German Enlightenment. So let's check first his concept on industrialization. So I've mentioned that he defines techniques as life lived through other means than life itself. It's because Stiegler, following the Girard, argues that since prehistoric times and the first tools, human, cultural, and technical evolution has been a composite process. The human being is, in Stiegler's view, a prosthetic being, and each type of technology externalizes and optimizes an aspect of our being human. Clothes, for example, externalize and optimizes our skin's ability to protect our body, like shoes externalize and optimize our foot's ability to make us mobile. There is, however, a further crucial aspect to techniques that Stiegler makes central to his reflection on techniques, namely that in his view, any form of techniques is always also a form of memory. For example, when we make a stone knife, we reproduce the first act of the invention of a stone knife, which Stiegler views as a form of remembrance of the first time the idea of a stone knife was externalized in the creation of a knife from stone. This is why Régis Debray, who in 2002 introduced me to the work of Stiegler, describes Stiegler as a Heideggerian technophile. Unlike for Heidegger, for whom techniques threatens to close our world in the phenomenological sense of a life world, Stiegler is of the view that techniques as prosthesis and memory co-constitutes our world. It's not to say that Stiegler is oblivious to the threat that techniques may pose to our world, as becomes clear in his concept of industrialization. A lot of his early work focused on how mnemonic or memory technologies such as the alphabet, writing and printing changed humanity and our life world. This forms the background of his definition of industrialization, that is, the industrialization of consciousness and memory itself. In Stiegler's view, the mechanization of production is certainly an important aspect of the Industrial Revolution, but what for him really distinguishes this revolution is that it is the first technical revolution in human history where technologies of memory themselves propel the revolution in an autocatalytic process. That is, a process of which the execution in turn speeds up the process. In memory technologies such as the photograph, the phonogram, film, radio, television, the computer, and all sorts of digital recording technologies linked in massive networks, we see the externalization of the contents of human consciousness, its recording and its dissemination in economies of scale that fundamentally alter human knowledge, thought, and behavior. A film, for example, begins as an idea in the mind of a filmmaker. It is externalized in the making and recording of a film and is then disseminated through cinemas, television channels, DVD sales, and streaming services. In Stiegler's view, this, for example, is one of the key reasons why the 20th century became the American century, and he cites an American senator who declared already in 1912 that trade follows films. Stiegler extensively analyzes how the American way of life became such an object of desire worldwide. To conceive of the Industrial Revolution in this way helps us to understand why Stiegler argues that it is an ongoing, still ongoing, and ever more rapid revolution, which in my view is also why talk of so-called first, second, third, and fourth industrial revolutions amount to muddy and even dangerously irresponsible thinking that should rather be left aside. This brings us then to his second concept here, performativity beyond consciousness. Already in 2001's third volume of Technics and Time, which focused extensively on cinema and television, Stiegler came up with his concept of performativity beyond consciousness. Writing with the already then massive global influence of cable television networks in mind, Stiegler explains how the determination of what counts as a global event happens beyond the conscious decisions of one or more individuals. It may be that a few journalists first pick up on a local event, but the process that turns it into a worldwide event takes on a life of its own, is in principle usually unpredictable, and happens far quicker than what most of us can think. These processes that are distinguished by their high and fast performance, Stiegler calls the performativity beyond consciousness. And needless to say that we all saw false or fake news in the era of digital media and platforms as a result of performativity beyond consciousness cause much more damage than in the era of oral or print reporting, such as Paul Virilio already in 1998 predicted in his book, The Information Bomb. We will come back to this below. And then third, quickly on Stiegler's commitment to Kant and 18th century Franco-German Enlightenment. In much of the work that he published between 1998 and 2007, he investigated what he regarded as three key examples of the successful adoption of a revolutionary memory technology. The first of these is ancient Athens successfully adopting the alphabet, which in his view was instrumental in Solon's legal and democratic reforms, Athenian citizenship, and the birth of ancient Greek philosophy and science. The second of these is the medieval Latin Christian otium, that space and time where religious, philosophical, scientific, educational, and aesthetic activities took place as a result of the successful adoption of this form of a religion of the book, in which liturgical practices was a key to the ordinary masses of believers also being included in the otium, and of which the church was, of course, the key institution. The third example is then the Franco-German Enlightenment of the late 18th century, what Stiegler sees as Kant's print-inspired concept of reason mediated by the public, that is constituted by those who read, and its concomitant understanding of citizenship and mass education, which in its turn again ensured mass participation in this form of the otium. And here the school and the university are the key institutions. Reflecting on the enormous successes achieved in France after the educational reforms of Jules Ferry in the late 19th century, and because of his admiration for Kant's concept of reason, Stiegler has, on the one hand, over the past 20 years, warned against the dangers of unsuccessful public adoption of analog and digital technologies and pleaded for what he calls a new otium of the people, in which the pursuit and dissemination of new knowledge and its concomitant cultural elevation will be central to further human cultural evolution. Should we fail to achieve such an otium or successful adoption of these technologies, Stiegler expresses apocalyptic fears for the fate of humanity and the planet. And with this in mind, we can now turn in section 2 to how, or the rest of section 2, how he develops these ideas in his 2015 book, Automatic Society, and then begin to compare them to some Girardian concepts. This is where I really stick my neck out. So, the Automatic Society analyzed by Girard and Stiegler. I have already referred to Stiegler's fear that failure to achieve a successful public adoption of digital technologies and platforms would threaten both humanity and the planet. These fears are explored by Stiegler at great length in Automatic Society 1, published in 2015, The Future of Work, against the background of the view of many scientists that humanity has entered a new geological era, the Anthropocene. That is an era where human activity, instead of geological and biological developments, now determine the state of life on Earth and of the Earth itself. It is no surprise that Stiegler concurs with the general view that the Industrial Revolution is the root cause of the Anthropocene, but he goes further by pleading for an updated version of his concept of a new otium of the people, which he calls the neg-Anthropocene, that also cleverly plays on the physical concepts or the physics concepts of entropy and neg-entropy, Schrödinger. Although there is much debate as to whether increasing automation of production will lead to massive unemployment or to new kinds of work, Stiegler is of the firm view that massive unemployment is a given, which is why he essentially calls for some sort of universal basic income, and argues that we are seeing the end of work as we knew it in the post-war economy. As a quote from him, "The liberation of work is not a question of reducing work time in order to share it out and thereby reduce the rate of unemployment. It is a matter of eliminating unemployment by eliminating employment as the key status and function of a macroeconomic system that was conceived and implemented by Keynes and Roosevelt, but whose effects have now been reversed." Against the background of these points of departure and Stiegler's analysis of the automatic society, we can now take a closer look at a number of concepts employed by him with, I think, pressing interest to any Girardian scholar. The 6 concepts that I shall briefly discuss in the following order are desire, mimesis, algorithmic governmentality, growing indifferentiation, sacrifice, and the new otium of the people. So let's look at desire. As I argued earlier, Stiegler, in my view, subscribes to what Girard calls the romantic view of desire, that is, desire seen as unique to the individual. For example, when he writes in Automatic Society, desire is always the expression of a non-adapted singularity. Singularity, a term that he inherited from Derrida and that he applies to both individuals, in his terminology, psychic individuations, and to groups, in his terminology, collective individuations. And I will spare you Stiegler's jargon. Is famous for his neologisms, which makes it not easy reading. I've also earlier argued that Stiegler furthermore clearly works in the Freudian projectionist tradition of desire as a sort of autonomous force that supposedly invests this or that object to turn it into an object of desire. For example, in section 12 of Automatic Society, Stiegler affirmatively recapitulates and elaborates upon Freud's views of fetishistic perversion and libidinal economy, just after in section 11 writes very much in a Freudian vein about the object in which desire invests. Although Girard had, of course, a very different view of the mimetic nature of desire and of the desiring subject and the object of desire, as he first put it forth in 1961's To See Desire in the Novel, how he already in the same book discussed, striking to me how in the same book he discussed how advertising and mass media increase mimetic rivalry, sometimes also called mimetism or negative mimetism. Stiegler certainly shares the same view, as we can see by briefly considering his concept of the hyper-industrial society that in his view first arises in the 1960s. Arguing against what he calls the myth of the post-industrial society, where the ongoing mechanization and automation of production would supposedly make more leisure time available to people, Stiegler, in my view, convincingly argues that the actual transition that took place from the 1960s onwards is one from the industrial to the hyper-industrial society. So he says in the industrial society, fossil fuels provided the main source of energy. The proletarian is the person who has only his or her physical energy to sell for an income, and the industrialist aims to control the means of production. But in the hyper-industrial society, human attention replaces fossil fuels. It's now the main source of energy and commodity. The new proletarian is all of us in this conference. It's the person who earns an income through his or her cognitive energy. For example, people working in the services industries, IT, finance sector, science, and education. And the hyper-industrialist aims to control both the means of production and the patterns of consumption. If the factory was the prime example of controlling the means of production in the industrial society, the media conglomerate that produces its own content and distributes it on its own channels and platforms is the prime example of controlling both the means of production and patterns of consumptions in the hyper-industrial society. The key to this is to capture human attention in the so-called leisure industries such as sport and entertainment, And it should be obvious that this goes hand in hand with what I would call the industrialization of mimetism, of which so-called social media influences is but the latest example. In the latter regard, it is always striking and even somewhat tragicomic when a so-called social influencer, clearly completely ignorant of how he or she in principle immerses their so-called followers in structurally irresolvable mimetic rivalry by flaunting a lifestyle that is in principle out of reach of most of these followers, how such an influencer ends up expressing hurt and surprise at the so-called haters amongst their followers. Referring to a groundbreaking 2013 article by the Belgian scholars Thomas Berns and Antoinette Rouvroy that Stiegler discusses at length in Automatic Society, he warns against the destruction of desire as such. Here is a quote. According to IBM, personalization and smart marketing are transforming marketing and advertising into consumer services. Berns and Rouvroy showed that these consumer services in reality consist in adapting individual desire to supply. Rather than the adaptation of desire to supply, we should refer to a destruction of desire by self-fulfilling anticipations of drive-based fantasies of every kind, such as voyeurism, exhibitionism, the mimetism of conventional artificial crowds in general, and through profiling that precedes all this, end quote. So let's look at mimesis. For our purposes, it's important to understand that from a Girardian viewpoint, a critical threshold is crossed when mimetism is industrialized and automated. We may say in Girardian terms that this comes down to the multiplication and targeted offering of models, in the sense that Girard uses it, targeted offering of models to each and every one of us, especially through so-called social networks and platforms based on big data, algorithms, and personal or user profiling. Stiegler spells out the implication of this with reference to the network effect, which is a key aspect of what I call industrialized mimetism when he writes the following. In automatic society, those digital networks referred to as social channel behavioral expressions by subordinating them to mandatory protocols to which psychic individuals bend because they are drawn to do so through what is referred to as the network effect, which, with the addition of social networking, becomes an automated herd effect. That is one that is highly mimetic. It therefore amounts to a new form of artificial crowd in the sense Freud gave to this expression, end quote. Stiegler in the very next paragraph at length cites Freud, citing Gustav Le Bon on the notion of the psychological crowd. Le Bon, of course, also being an important interlocutor for Girard, and with reference to Nidesh Lotu, also developed important analyses of contemporary populisms and their challenges to democracy. It is also important to note another key feature of industrial mimetism, which is that it happens in a much more immediate fashion than any preceding form of mimesis in human history. We know that Girard described the ever more immediate forms of mimetism with the transition from pre-modernity's external mediation towards what he sees as that which in itself constitutes modernity, internal mediation, and that for him was portrayed in its most radical form by Dostoevsky in Notes from Underground. For lack of a better term to describe what we are seeing with industrial mimetism, all I can suggest is that we refer to total and immediate industrial mediation, where algorithmically harvested memories of personalized models presented on the basis of user profiling threaten to completely shape individual human consciousness and behavior, leading Stiegler to argue that it thus becomes possible to remote control one by one the members of a network. This is so-called personalization, while subjecting them to viral processes of a kind never before seen, end quote. From a Girardian perspective, viral is of course the key term here, as it refers us to what may be called industrially induced mimetic contagion, against which reasoned argument and scientific facts are powerless, as the ever-increasing tribalism in politics worldwide and the recent phenomenon of the so-called anti-vaxxers clearly demonstrate. This brings us to concept 3 of this discussion, namely Barron's and Rouvroy's concept of algorithmic governmentality that he at length discusses. Barron's and Rouvroy, building on the Foucauldian concept of governmentality, developed the concept of algorithmic governmentality to describe how the harvesting of massive quantities of data and their algorithmic exploitation is used today to effectively govern individual and group behavior. Whereas statistics was used in the modern state to plan ahead, algorithmic governmentality comes down to massive private enterprises striving to shape future individual and group behavior. It's no longer about planning ahead, it's about creating the future. Stiegler spells out the implications. Here's the quote. This affecting in advance of possible behaviors affects all powers to act as the automatic production of the possible reduced to the probable. It is based on a passage from statistical government to algorithmic government, which is also the passage from a public governmentality of the state to governmentality as governance by generalized privatization, which is the destruction by a hypertrophied private sphere of private life as well as of the public thing, the res publica. End quote. Is there a better way today to describe the loss of human freedom than phrasing it as the reduction of the possible to the probable? Arguably, this is a much more dangerous form of totalitarianism than what we saw in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, because it instrumentalizes the concept of individual freedom in a process of total and immediate industrial mediation to shape human behavior. And the outcome of this seems to me as threatening and unpredictable as Russia in 1918 and Germany in 1933. In a world where the automation of mediation takes place, precious little is left of what Girard on rare occasions referred to as positive mimesis, or what Alice de McIntyre describes as the mediating effects of traditions. Stiegler affirmatively cites Barron's and Rouvroy in arguing that this comes down to the colonization of public space by a hypertrophied private sphere, which leads to the disappearance of common experience. For the purposes of this paper, one has to ask whether it is any wonder that the public sphere is in such a haggard state today, with all the concomitant dangers this poses to socio-political stability. In this regard, special attention should be paid to the medium that nowadays has by far the greatest effect on the public sphere, that is the internet, which is totally colonized by algorithmically based search engines that people use under the illusion that they themselves are conducting a search for information, leading, for example, to even ostensibly well-informed people citing publications from scientific journals in public debates, only to need a genuine scientific expert to point out that the journal in question is not all that reputable. This leads Stiegler to conclude, citing Barron's and Rouvroy again, algorithmic government is an automatic government that claims to be able to function on autopilot, that is, without pilots or thinking. It dispenses with institutions and public debate. It replaces prevention in favor only of preemption. In short, it installs an automatic society in which there develops a computational technological performativity, itself supposedly totally automatized. End quote. For the Kantian that Stiegler is in his own way, this is a total catastrophe, since the faculties of reason, which in Technics and Time 3 shows to actually be co-constituted by printing, are now and will remain completely external to human consciousness, except if a new successful public adoption of contemporary memory technologies is achieved in a new otium of the people. For now, Stiegler thinks such an otium is systemically hindered by a growing loss of differentiation. This brings us then to growing indifferentiation number 4. As most of the audience for this paper probably know, Girard argued that it is not difference that is at the root of conflict, but sameness. In the extension of this, he reflected on the danger for increased conflict when differences fade in a social group and gives rise to the famous mimetic crisis, which in turn leads to a collective murder and scapegoating, and which of course in the English vocabulary is known as undifferentiation. In Battling to the End, as most of us know, Girard reflected extensively on how a renewed undifferentiation in our time contributes to renewed scapegoating, violence, and a heightened apocalyptic sense of the time. Given what the world has lived through in the course of the last 18 months, it is worth quoting here again what Girard said to Bernard Stiegler in 2007. It just again shows his incredible foresight. He says, terrorist wars and looming pandemics recall the plague in Thebes. The devastating nature of bird flu virus HN51, which is a mutant that can kill hundreds of turkeys in only a few hours, spreads through bird migrations, but especially thanks to air traffic. It is a pandemic that could cause hundreds of thousands of deaths in a few days, and is a phenomenon typical of the undifferentiation now coursing through the planet. We can counter it with vaccines so long as we share them, and do not limit them to rich nations, seeing how porous borders have become between countries and between all differences in general. End quote. Now consider what Stiegler has to say about industrial standardization, which is taken a step further with algorithmic governmentality. He writes, industrial standardization seems to be leading the contemporary Anthropocene to the possibility of a destruction of life as the burgeoning and proliferation of differences, as the biodiversity, sociodiversity, cultural diversity, and psychodiversity of singularities generated by default as psychic individuation and collective individuations, end quote. One has to ask, in the light of these assessments by Girard and Stiegler, whether the processes of undifferentiation that were already at work before the current pandemic were not greatly sped up by our loss of social contact and its forced increased reliance on digital platforms in our states of confinement and lockdown. Is this not what played out in the storming of the US Capitol on 6 January? Or vaccine nationalisms and vaccine new colonialisms, or the social divisions deepened by fake news? This brings me then to sacrifice, and I put together with its sacrament and the new otium of the people. Girard, in his last apocalyptic reflections, as publicized in Battling to the End, took solace in his Christian convictions, which by no means led him, of course, to a defeatist position. On the contrary, in the introduction to the English version of Battling to the End, he wrote in 2010 with reference to our apocalyptic time, does not Christ himself invite us to be more cunning than the serpent? We are more at war than ever at a time when war itself no longer exists. We have to fight a violence that can no longer be controlled or mastered. Yet, what if triumph were not the most important thing? What if the battle were worth more than the victory? End quote. Stiegler, in similar vein, in Automatic Society, admits that a huge battle is to be waged if a new otium of the people is to be established as the next Anthropocene. But for him, this is no reason to surrender to the contemporary techno-economic forces of undifferentiation. For the sake of time, I shall limit my remarks on Stiegler's views on the new otium of the people to 3 brief points in order to demonstrate respectively, first, how Stiegler, in my view, cobbles together Girardian, Catholic, and Romantic elements in his ideal, which seem to me, unfortunately, too diverse to hold together. The Girardian element is limited to a very short and very cryptic comment about sacrifice. In a long discussion on the role of dreams in science and artistic creation and the need to dream anew in order to help bring about the new otium of the people, Stiegler writes, but for this to be possible, and inasmuch as it concerns noetic souls, that is, psychic and collective individuation, it is necessary that these Blanchoian asymmetrical realities share a default of community and a fundamental delinquence, a primordial delinquere, of which every sacrificial form is the revenance that tries to quasi-causally invert it into a promise. In a footnote, Stiegler mentions that this description of every sacrificial form as a revenance is sourced from Gerald Moore's 2011 book, Politics of the Gift, exchanges in post-structuralism. Elsewhere in Automatic Society, he promises to develop these reflections in the second volume of the book, which has so far not been published. For our purposes, it can nevertheless be surmised that Stiegler sought to connect sacrificial forms to what he from very early on in his work calls le défaut qu'il faut, that is roughly the lack that we humans by default have, that we always again supplement with techniques as prosthesis, and that we must never attempt to permanently work away. For example, in the form of the systematic and automatic evasion of failure or deviation by algorithmic governmentality, which is satirized wonderfully by the British novelist Joanna Kavenna in a 2019 novel, Z. Stiegler elaborates on this by following Bataille's notion of sacrifice when he references Bataille's so-called unproductive experiences that are always related to sacrifice, that is, to the production of sacred things constituted by an operation of loss. And then Stiegler adds the following comment: let us say for the moment that every loss sacrifices, sacralizes, and sanctifies a default of being older than any being. In this tenor of primordial default, noetic intermittence is constituted. We shall return in a moment to this notion of intermittence, but for now I just want to comment that Stiegler seems to see human incompleteness and loss as the source of sacrifice, which seems to me at odds with Girard's notion of sacrifice as the ritual repetition of the original collective murder to keep the threat of a renewed mimetic crisis at bay. Unless, it's another possibility, the original collective murder in Girard is understood as an operation of loss that constitutes the production of sacred things, including presumably not only the ancient gods, but also ritual objects. As for the Catholic element of Stiegler's new otium, which I already mentioned earlier with reference to the medieval Latin Christian otium that he invokes as an earlier example of the successful public adoption of the reigning memory technology, Stiegler refers to French Catholics advocating recently for the introduction of a family allowance to support parents in educating their children, and writes, such Christians understand on the basis of the sacraments that what is essential, which has no price, is always something that lies above and beyond the market. That is, whereas he sees all sacrifice as somehow related to loss and human incompleteness that must always again be cultivated, here he sees Catholic sacraments as pointing to a value beyond the market, which is precisely for him the sort of value that the new otium of the people as the nec Anthropocene must cultivate. Then the romantic element of this new otium in automatic society's insistence on disautomation or noetic intermittence or reveries is, in my view, a continuation of Stiegler's faith in art as a source of social salvation, which I have elsewhere argued has its roots as far back as in the Romantic thinker Schiller's 1794 letters on the aesthetical education of man. In automatic society, Stiegler sources his plea for the right to intermittence in the nec Anthropocene from the French legal recognition in 1936 of the so-called intermittent du spectacle, that is, casual workers in the theatre and entertainment industries who are supported by an allowance from the state when they are not earning pay from work in a production at a given time. In similar vein, he also in automatic society advocates a so-called art of hyper-control, that is a type of art that can counter the tendencies to social hyper-control of the automatic society as it currently stands. It brings me to my conclusion. I will end with a few all too brief comments on Girard Stiegler and artificial intelligence, especially in the form of automation and the use of algorithms. It's four remarks I conclude with. The first is, it seems to me that Stiegler does make a conclusive case that current trends of automation and commercial uses of algorithms comes down to an industrialization of mimesis that not only renders mimesis useless as a form of human cultural evolution, but actively and systematically turns it into a powerful source of undifferentiation with concomitant new forms of scapegoating, social dissolution, and the increase of violence. Second remark, building on the critique of Stiegler that I've developed elsewhere, I have serious reservations about the new otium of the people if the end goal is the invention and discovery of new knowledge, and that is what he advocates for as a Kantian. Human curiosity for new knowledge is of course a perennial phenomenon, but arguably this curiosity is motivated always by an end goal beyond knowledge, whether it be God, the true, the good, and the beautiful, Aristotelian eudaimonia, Buddhist enlightenment, and the like. In this regard, Stiegler seems to me still too tied to the Kantian secular form of the otium as he sees it represented in Kant and the Franco-German Enlightenment, while at the same time, as a French atheist, he more or less takes secularization as a fait accompli, and he does not really consider how the older spiritual ideals that I've just referred to are traditionally much more important than knowledge in the otia of the past, and how they may still remain relevant. I was very struck by how the two young speakers in the previous session, coming from the global north in a sense, converted to Christianity. It belies the secularist thesis. In this regard, and as a third comment, I want to refer to a 2018 article by the Catholic philosophical theologian, listen up Innsbruck. It's Johannes Hoff, who has since 2020 joined the same faculty of Innsbruck where Girard's taught, as since the days of Raymond Schwager found such a warm reception. In Hoff's article 2018, The Eclipse of Sacramental Realism in the Age of Reform, Rethinking Luther's Gutenberg Galaxy in a Post-Digital Age, Hoff, who also seriously engages with the work of Stiegler, writes the following. In the digital age, we had to cope with the emergence of social and economic inequalities caused by unequal access to or unequal familiarity with electronic information and communication technologies. In our present time, a new divide is about to emerge, one caused by a lack of the practical, ethical, emotional, and spiritual skills to implement digital technologies in our analogical life world. Poorly designed technologies encourage the economic exploitation of our attention, undermine our cognitive self-confidence and creativity, and pollute our gift to be attuned to our never fully penetrable social and natural environment. Hence, a new divide emerges between those who are able to focus and direct their attention and those who leave this task to the invisible hand of the market, globalized ranking software agents, or the algorithms of the Church of Google. End of this brilliant quote. I am in full agreement with Hoff that the digital divide that should really worry us is not one of access, but of adoption. That is, a divide between those who have the necessary control over their attention so as to not be controlled by these technologies, and then those who do not have such control and who are controlled by these technologies. But this type of attentive control, however, ultimately, I think, stems from ancient contemplative practices, whether they be the spiritual practices of the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers that Pierre Hadot described, prayer, fasting, and celebrating the Mass or the divine liturgy, as per various forms of liturgical Christianity, Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican, etc., various forms of meditation, and so on. I do not here want to argue that all these practices have similar worth or end goals, and as an Orthodox Christian, I obviously have my views on the matter. My point is simply that such practices are all in the services of ideals more powerful than just the ideal of new knowledge. My fourth and last comment, and I'm sorry about this, but I have to be honest, is a somewhat somber comment, perhaps in line with Girard's statement in Battling to the End that the apocalypse has already started. That is, based on the analysis of both Girard and Stiegler of our era, and based on how difficult it has become in our time of automated mimesis and behavior to still get people to understand and train in these ancient traditions, I do not harbor high hopes that these traditions will neutralize the threats of industrialized mimesis, but they do remain our best hope. And all the more reason that I have to agree with Girard that, to quote him in the end, we have to fight a violence that can no longer be controlled or mastered, but that the battle is worth more than the victory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johan. That's very rich presentation, and I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful discussion. I will, at this point, turn to Joachim to offer his response to your paper. Joachim, we can't hear. You need to unmute. Joachim.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, okay.
I'm here. Okay, thank you, Sandy. Johan, thank you for your excellent lecture. I really enjoyed it. And although I didn't know much about Stiegler, I'm convinced by your paper that connections between Girard and Stiegler are very promising and insightful. It helps to make the fundamental structures of mimesis more concrete, to put them in a historical view as he does. What I want to do in this brief response is trying to add another perspective to more clarify the historical developments you sketch. So I'm adding and not replacing. Despite of the fact that your line of thought is to a high extent historical and that memory plays an important role in it, your concepts and metaphors are mainly spatial, following Stiegler. Humans as prosthetic beings, the externalization by technology, and make three short, well, not quotes, but just points to your lecture. The human being, the human being is in Stiegler's view a prosthetic being, and each type of technology externalizes and optimizes an aspect of our being human. Clothes, shoes, glasses, and things like that. And the second point is Stiegler is of the view that techniques as prosthesis and memory co-constitutes our world. Any form of techniques is always also a form of memory. But, and that's my third thing, in memory technologies, such as the photographs, the phonogram, the film, the radio, television, the computer, and all sorts of digital recording technologies linked in massive networks, we see again the externalization of the contents of human consciousness, its recording and its dissemination in economies of scale that fundamentally alter human knowledge, thought, and behavior. Adding to this point, I want to briefly introduce the notions of acceleration and resonance developed by the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa. Perhaps you know him if you heard of him. Hartmut Rosa, born in 1965, is working in Jena, Germany. Whereas your concepts and metaphors are spatial, Rosa builds on a time metaphor. And after my response, I will put a link in the chat to a brief TED talk of Rosa, who explains himself, of course, better than I can do that. But before I reach that point, I want to get first want to get a bit more into your paper and your line of thought. In your paper, you mentioned three key examples of the successful adoption of a revolutionary memory technology. And I will focus on the second one. But the first one is you point at ancient Athens successfully adopting the alphabet, the invention of the alphabet. The third is the Franco-German Enlightenment of the late 18th century, what Stiegler sees as Kant's print-inspired concept of reason. But the second point is the medieval Latin Christian otium, and you mentioned that many times in your talk. The space and time where religious, philosophical, scientific, educational, and aesthetic activities took place as a result of the successful adoption of this form of a religion of the book, in which liturgical practices was a key to the ordinary masses of believers, also being included in the otium, of which the church was, of course, the key institution. I have some questions about this notion of otium, because I'm not, perhaps you can help me understand what you mean by otium and, well, sketch a kind of a picture of that. Stiegler has, on the one hand, over the past 20 centuries, warned against the dangers of unsuccessful public adoption of analog and digital technologies and pleaded for what he calls a new otium of the people, in which the pursuit and the dissemination of new knowledge and its concomitant cultural elevation will be central to further human evolution? Should we fail to achieve such an otium, Stiegler expresses apocalyptic fears for the fate of humanity and the planet. So there's a huge hypothèque on otium. Otium seems to derive from schola, the Greek notion of schola, where our words school and scholar and scholarship, etc., derive from. It's something like leisure, unhurried time, time for study, time for talk, time for discussion, time for philosophy, in one word. And at this point, I want to introduce the perspective for Hartmut Rosa. Like Stiegler, Rosa understands modernity as an ongoing and ever more rapid evolution and revolution. Rosa says modernity is the dynamization of the world. It sets the world in motion. It's a more or less classical, not to say cliche, picture of the Middle Ages. Middle Ages, everything was quiet and no motion, and then modernity, motion came in. Well, I forgive him this cliche, but still, the world is set in motion. And he calls that the social acceleration. He has two notions by the acceleration. I will first explain this one, and then the notion of resonance. And then here I'm showing you this big, more than 800 pages book of Rosa, Resonance. It's also translated in English. I have here the original German version. Social acceleration. In the 16th century, ships went on exploring voyages of discovery. In the 18th century, it was the dynamization of the world in steamships and railways. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, we get cars and planes. But not only these vehicles are multiplying and going faster and faster, also images, ideas, data, and not to forget money goes all over the world in an accelerating tempo. Our lives are speeded up. We have a shortage of time. We see the shrinking of the present, and we're all running to keep the pace. Right? We take fast food, we do speed dating, we have power naps, and we get fast reading and all those kind of things. And the societal context of all this is growth, acceleration, innovation. And modern society, he says, cannot be stable unless it speeds up all the time. Well, this has a price. The price is ecological. And you cannot speed up the woods and the fishes in the sea and the lakes. You cannot speed up them. If you take more than is reproduced, well, you make they will be exhausted. And the trouble is then, according to Rosa, we do not resonate anymore with creation. And all practices that take more time, like democracy, democracy is time-consuming, and democracy is under pressure when under this development of acceleration. And then he said, "What's the solution? What's the alternative?" And then he comes to this notion of resonance, experience of resonance. When he asks people, what's the last time that you were really touched by something? What brought you to tears, etc.? Was it an insight? Was it falling in love? Was it an intense activity? Was it an experience of art, of experience of nature? Was it a religious experience? And the solution is, don't change the world, but change the relation to the world. Resonance is opposed to alienation. And there, my question is otium something like resonance? Is otium the place or the time that we can really resonate with our environment and with each other, and then, well, have some kind of a free space from this acceleration? It's just a question, and I'm not sure what you exactly mean by otium, but it's my question. So this is a positive side of resonance as the solution or escape, at least, from this acceleration. But more than this, and also Rosa doesn't speak about mimesis, and I don't know if he knows the work of Girard, but can we also articulate mimesis in terms of resonance? Rosa highly values resonance as a possible solution to acceleration and alienation, but I'm afraid we know better. We as Girardians know better. Resonance can also, as we from a Girardian perspective will say, resonance is always resonance with the sound of the model, the voice of the model, and what the model says, does, and displays. So how free is this resonance? And how free is this otium as a free space or a free time? Can we get rid of the mimesis? Can we put it outside? I don't think so. I mean, Girard says he equals mimesis to gravity, and there is no place outside of gravity, and there's also no place outside of mimesis. So these are my questions to you, and if one small question aside. And that's a very important side. Where's the scapegoat? Where's the scapegoat in Stiegler, and where is the scapegoat in your paper? I missed it. Expulsion of the scapegoat brings peace and harmony back for the time being, as we know from the work of Girard. And is the expulsion of the scapegoat, is that the harmony that comes after the expulsion of the scapegoat, is that resonant? It's more a question to Rose than a question to you, but still, we are talking about this now. So these are my short remarks and my response to your beautiful lecture, Johan. So I hope you can clear this notion of otium and elaborate a bit on that. Thank you.
Johan, thank you very, very much. This is the kind of help that I called for at the beginning of my lecture. So let me, I'm going to try to be brief in my reaction, that we can also allow time for questions. Let me first say about the remark you made about the tendency towards more spatial metaphors. This is, of course, the risk that you run when you try to not only compare two such giants, but also to make a portrayal of one of them in the form of Stiegler. I must immediately stress Stiegler, being a Heideggerian, is incredibly attuned to acceleration. For example, in Automatic Society, he writes at great length about, if I'm not mistaken, I can't remember the precise figures, but the speed with which a command from your brain to a limb travels. Let's say it's, I don't know, 40 million kilometers or per hour, whatever. Whereas he says that the speed with which information, some of the calculations say it's 500 million kilometers per hour. So and he's a great fan of Virilio, of course, well before Rosa made acceleration the key aspect of modernity. So I can, I should stress that Stiegler is very, very aware of this, and this is why, secondly, the notion of intermittence and the otium is for him so important. It's to pause. You know, I mean, like you said, indeed, he points out the Greek version of it is the scholein, and we cannot have reflection, we cannot have democracy, deliberation, etc., without the schole or the otium. A word about the otium. Perhaps some of our Catholic friends in the audience may be better able to assist us even better here. But the otium, I'm more a fan of the Greeks of the Romans, but the otium, it's indeed derived from the scholein, but it goes back to the time of the Roman Empire. Cicero, for example, wrote about it, or Cicero, if you want to pronounce it like that. And so the otium is not so much doing nothing. It's doing the things of the spirit, if I can put it like that. It's prayer, it's contemplation, but it's also education, it's scientific research, it is aesthetic creativity, all of those things. And I think the stuff that you and I and most people in this audience are engaged in a lot of our working lives. So Stiegler's concern is, and this I think, one of my reservations about him is that I think he tends to draw two straight historical lines. You know, he will, for example, say that from the ancient Greeks up until very recently, writing determined more or less everything. He calls it the orthographic epoch, which I think is a great simplification. And I agree with you, the views about the Middle Ages of being immobile that you also find in Stiegler. I just can't agree with that. Having said that, maybe it's one of his weaknesses of the long lines that he draws, is that he tends to read the way that the Greeks found a balance between the work that essentially the slaves did and the farmers, the subsistence work, I forget the Greek term in Plato now, but those doing the dirty work, if I can put it like that. So what the philosophers did, that was otium, that was scholing. Then if you go to the Roman Empire, what the Stoics did, the melete is the concept that he uses. There's, interestingly enough, to his own experience of being in jail, 5 years in jail, his own melete, he calls it. And then, so otium for him is a sort of key motif in human history where if we successfully adopt the latest or the most influential memory technology, that should then help us to get to this time of reflection, creation, and so on. I hope that answers your question. Then about the scapegoat, Joachim, I had to, it's a poor excuse, but I had to cut that part of my lecture due to time constraints. But just to answer it very quickly, I did say in my introduction that when we go to the old word pharmakon, as Miresh Lotu also reminded us earlier today, Girard will speak about pharmakos, the scapegoat. Stiegler, following Derrida, will speak pharmakon, the poison and the remedy. But the only exception to this that I know in all of his work is in the book on the pharmacology of the National Front, now the National Rally in France, where he gives two interesting analyses of scapegoating. The one is that he says, the one that we all know, where left-wing French intellectuals scapegoat people who vote for the Front National as being reactionary, racist, and blah, blah, blah. And then the other one is also the Front National supporters themselves scapegoating immigrants for problems that Stiegler says really arises from economic liberalization and technological acceleration. And Stiegler's point is that this type of scapegoating around and by Front National supporters in France paralyzes French politics and makes them unable as a country to move to a successful adoption of these new digital technologies. And then as a last remark, your question concerning mimesis and resonance, yeah, that's why I also wish, I think like many Girardians, that René would have said something more about positive mimesis. Now this little chance I took was to suggest that I think when McIntyre writes about how we are mediated by traditions, that we have mentors, that we are disciples of Christ, etc., etc. These I think are such examples. And interestingly enough, about your question on resonance, it's a beautiful concept. Thank you for that. Stiegler, in his first volume, I think, of his book on symbolic misery, he affirmatively cites Jacques Rancière to claim that all politics is a politics of feeling together, of common feeling. Yeah? That's that common experience and so on. So I can more or less see that fitting with the resonance, the affect in a sense, yeah, and that affect in a sense also cannot really take hold of us, especially collectively, if we do not have a collective otium or schole or space of reflection and all that goes with it. But I've probably responded too long, but thank you, Joachim, those would be my reactions.
Thank you. Senny, can I just put one small question again?
Please, yes.
Well, can we back to that otium notion? I think it's a very important notion. Can we clarify it more by referring to the distinction praxis poiesis in Aristotle? I mean, poiesis is all the production, what Hannah Arendt calls labor and work, and praxis is what the elite does. So doing politics, philosophy, sport, games, things like that, conversation. That's praxis, and this is a class distinction in Aristotle. Not in Hannah Arendt, but in Aristotle it is. Perhaps I think in the Middle Ages was also a class notion.
Yeah. Incidentally, Joachim, Stiegler very explicitly appropriates and reads Aristotle in that way, and of course, like a fool, being Orthodox, I forget the important Catholic references. the key one is in St. Augustine, the distinction between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
A question posed by Wolfgang, also interested in the otium. Wolfgang writes, regarding otium, Stiegler seems to be quite close to the Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper. And he cites the book Leisure, the Basis of Culture, the Philosophic Act, translated by Alexander Drew in 2009. And he asks, was Stiegler perhaps aware of this book from 1948? And he said, most likely not. So that's one question.
Yeah. Wolfgang, thank you for that question. Now, I speak under correction, but surprisingly, I think in his book on disbelief and discredit, the first or the second volume, that Pieper book was mentioned in passing, but I don't think Stiegler engaged with it sufficiently. I know a little bit about Pieper, and I fully agree with you that there are certainly parallels. And this is, I mean, it's not the purpose of tonight's or this afternoon's lecture to speak about how Stiegler continues Catholicism by other means than Catholic. But my argument is, although I love his work and I learned a lot from it, is that it takes Christian themes like the fall, hope, belief, the apocalypse, the diabolical, and the otium. He takes those concepts and he wants, in a sense, to have his Christian cake and eat it too, because he tries to do it in an atheist fashion. But in my view, the underpinning of his philosophy, and I think you can argue maybe the same for Heidegger, but maybe I shouldn't say that, is that there are such strong Catholic underpinnings. And I just think that, I love, I'm not a great liberal, but I love John Rawls's concept of the overlapping consensus that Charles Taylor also invokes, that people in a multicultural, multi-religious society or society of believers and atheists can agree on the same thing for very different reasons. And this is why it's so important for me in my own minuscule attempts to let Stiegler and the liturgical Christian world enter into a dialogue, because in the sort of secular atheist world, he's a very, very influential figure in philosophy of technology, but they tend to be very, of course, antagonistic towards Christianity. Whereas I think from the Christian side, we often don't think enough about technology. And I was so glad when I found what Johannes Hoff is doing. But anyway, that's too long an answer, sorry.
There seems to be a fascination with the notion of otium in the questions. Virtually every question so far has concerned the notion of otium.
It's crucial.
It's crucial, yeah.
Yeah.
Just a little bit more. Wolfgang says in passing, one of the reasons we hired Johannes Hoff at Innsbruck was his expertise in the digital age. He is, however, still a little bit uneasy about Girard.
I'm going to write him a letter soon, I promise.
Anyway, okay, so then others write, and then Dietmar Regensberger points out Johannes Hoff's book as well.
I'm aware of it.
Yeah. He mentions that it has a short passage on René Girard. Steve McKenna thinks it was a really interesting paper, and he thanks you for bringing in Rosa. Wolfgang adds that odium is a form of active passivity to be ready to receive.
That's beautiful.
That's Wolfgang's comment.
That's a beautiful formulation.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Wolfgang. Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you, Wolfgang. Yeah. And Helene Christini notes the put towards the plebeians, which seems to relate to what you had just explained about.
Yes, thank you, Helene.
The class distinction. Yeah. From Alexander O'Hara, odium is also in contrast to negotium, which is business or busyness. Right. Yeah. And Nicholas Vondiger wonders if he should link it up with receptive mimesis. Yeah. Anyway, and then Nidesh Lotu, I don't know if you want to make a response at any point to these. Nidesh Lotu says, thanks for the excellent lecture. I had a meeting scheduled in August 2020 to interview Stiegler and Mimesis for HOM videos, and unfortunately it could not happen. Your talk is a beautiful supplement and will pave the way to that. Another person, Timothy Reynolds, asks, is doxa not also important with otium, the doxa? No wonders about that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Timothy. I want to here refer to someone I think many of you would know, at least her work. It's Catherine Pickstock of Cambridge, who wrote that wonderful book after writing on the liturgical consummation of philosophy, in which she, of course, pleads for what she calls a doxological way of life. And I've discussed this also with Catherine at great length. And the thesis that Catherine developed and that I sort of in my own way also worked with in my work on Stiegler is that that we haven't touched on yet, Joachim, is why do we fall for these things? I mean, if this acceleration is so inhuman, why do we allow it to happen? Why do we allow this colonization by these new technologies, etc., etc.? And the key that Catherine gives us here is that she describes modernization as an ongoing process of liturgical impoverishment, where the older practices, now obviously she writes from a high Anglican Catholic perspective, all the practices of prayer and fasting and all of those fell by the wayside. In my own research, I was a fantastical book that I can recommend to all of you, a German medieval historian, his name is, the title of the book is History of the Hour. It's Girard and von Rossouw. Girard and von Rossouw. And he, for example, points out that as the mechanical clock came to be adopted increasingly from the 1500s in Europe, first the Protestants decided, well, the service will be 1 hour, and then the Catholics did the same, I think, in the run-up to Trent. I speak under correction. So the point is that as you have a liturgical impoverishment, now, and I think this is why the Romantics were so obsessed with art and education, because it's a secular equivalent, but in my view, it doesn't have the resonance. It doesn't have the effect that all the liturgical practices have. And let's not forget that, as Pickstock also points out, in the ancient Greek, liturgia is also one of the meanings is public acts of citizenship. It's like when you go and visit Bath in England, the old Roman Bath, you see the gymnasium and the temple next to each other. I found it very, very moving. So yes, by all means, I think that that sort of doxa, in a Christian sense at least, is the shall I say, even the precondition of a sustainable otium.
Just reading some other comments here. Here's a question from George Irving. Does Rosa's resonance correspond to a moment of selflessness, timelessness, effortlessness, richness, what an athlete or musician might describe as being in the zone? If so, is it a moment that excludes desire? He's asking about Rosa.
Joachim, you know your heart with Rosa better than what I do. Maybe you would come in here, but I would just, maybe I can just add something there, George. About the being in the zone. Stiegler has a wonderful analysis of Aristotle's 3 levels of the soul. The lowest, the vegetative or nutritive, so the basic everyday functions, sleeping, eating, bodily relief, and so on. The second level is more or less the everyday emotions, thoughts, and so on. And then the noetic is the highest level of consciousness. And then Aristotle, as I guess many of you would know, says only God can remain on the noetic level uninterrupted. We can only do it intermittently. But that sort of being in the zone or a state of noesis, it would very much be, well, I think in a Christian sense, even kenosis, in that complete act of self-emptying, that happens in the exchange with the face of the other or the broken body of the other, but obviously also in the doxa and so. But I know, Joachim, would you like to respond to that on being in the zone and the resonance?
I don't know if I understand you well. Being what? Being?
In the zone.
In the zone. What an athlete or musician might describe as being in the zone. Does it correspond to resonance, and does it exclude desire to be in the zone?
I don't think so. I think mimesis is unavoidable. It's everywhere and it's always there. The only thing you can do is to respond to it, as you can do with gravity. We can jump and dance and make fun, etc., despite of gravity and thanks to gravity. So that's the same with mimesis. There's always mimesis you cannot avoid. There's no free space where you can escape from mimesis. No, you can just you have to respond to it. And resilience is then a key notion. It's also a very popular notion these days, but it's a key notion. I have a hermeneutical way of understanding this mechanism. I can try to explain it in 1 minute. If you have this, I don't want to make a distinction between the contagious models of Girard on the one hand and the exemplars and role models who are like Nelson Mandela and other heroes on the other hand. There's no difference in the model. There's a difference in our relationship with the model. And hermeneutically spoken, also the model makes a hermeneutically spoken application of something valuable when he acts and when he desires something, etc. The crucial thing is, shall I imitate the model's application, or shall I make my own application? Yeah. And the inspiration of someone like Mandela inspires me to something valuable, to so-called value, but he also invites me to make my own application. So if Mandela, in his situation, in his context, he displayed values like forgiveness and courage and many things more. It's a crazy idiot idea to imitate Mandela and his applications. Application is this hermeneutical notion, derived from Gadamer.
I agree.
Yeah, I have to make my own, and the good news is I don't have to do it alone on my own. I mean, I can be helped by these inspiring examples. They can help me performing my own application. Of course, it's a creative action. It depends on creativity. It's slavishness versus creativity.
Here's a couple more comments that are made. Andrew Marr says, prayer can sometimes be put one in the zone. I'll give you a couple more to think about. George Dunn says, being in the zone or flow has much in common with the Chinese notion of wu wei, which could be defined as deeply focused but effortless acting.
That's OT, man.
Yeah. Andrew Marr adds, I think being in the zone is very mimetic, but it's good mimesis, rivalistic, as rivalry would drop one out of the zone.
If I can just
add
to that, Sandor,
please.
Andrew Marr that you read, prior to finding my way back to Christianity, I spent a good 15 years as a practicing Zen Buddhist, and 8 of those was as an ordained Zen monk. And so I can very much relate to the comments here, both from my own experience of Buddhist meditation and Orthodox hesychast prayer. But there's a dictum in Zen that I think many people probably know: if you think you are enlightened, you are not. Or if you think you're in the zone, you are not. And I think that, in a sense, it's what Andrew refers to there. It's when you think I am enlightened, there's immediately a moment of rivalry creeps in. But when you let that go, that's that application that Joachim so beautifully points out here. And I think that I just want to add, if I may, to Joachim's comment on application, I would be just careful not to only take it into what I do, but also I think this is the value of living traditions, is that it's also what we do. And within that I can have my individual appropriation of that tradition, and it resonates in a specific way with me, but I in a sense can rely on a broader collective wisdom or intelligence or whatever. But Sandro, I think you're missing some of the tough questions being bolded me here.
Well, why don't you want to pick them out, please?
Okay, there was one from Bernard Stiegler, if I pronounce your name correctly.
Yes.
He says, Amina, who wants to go back in time to different cultures when you consider how much more violence people experienced? Also, the concern for victims today and the global concerns for poor countries, does it not bring a little more optimism? Thank you, Per. If I can just clarify, this is the danger in the sort of line of thinking that I espouse, is you end up sounding like pining for a lost golden age, which of course never existed. For me, the key thing here is, let me just make two remarks. I mean, all ages have their own forms of violence and victims, but I do think that there is a reason why people still today convert to Christianity or take up Buddhism or yoga. My wife is a great yoga fan. And I think that it has to do with what you can call a science of silence, and a sort of perennial philosophy where techniques and approaches that were devised in most cases thousands of years ago still hold, because biologically we haven't changed that much from those times. So I think those traditions should guide us, and so it's a continuation. It's not a return to a lost past. The second remark, and that's why I said at the end I'm hesitant about my apocalyptic tone, because I am by nature an optimist. But I do fully agree with you. Of course, there's what René also taught us. There's this concern for the victim. There's much more to be positive about. But my worry still remains, and I would love to be enlightened of other answers to this new colonization that we're experiencing. My worry from personal experience in trying to teach people first Buddhist meditation, later now the Orthodox faith or whatever, is often it seems to me they've already been so colonized, so dumbed down, they just don't get it. And this is the thing that really, really worries me. You know, and that's, I can understand why Rodrey wrote about the Benedictine option. It threatens to be a cop-out, and we can't do it. We must keep on trying. This is my worry. And then, Sandra, I saw that comment from Rebecca Adams.
Right.
The pandemic not only made us more immediately dependent on technology, also made us aware of the physical and changed many people's daily rhythms. It also made them reconsider how they want to live. Churchill actually had more people coming to services because of Zoom. Could we see the pandemic as a moment of global self-awareness where we have become more receptive to how we might want to live in a less colonized way? Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. I wrote a newspaper column last year in April, May, where I tried to say more or less the same thing. That's my big hope. We were forced into a global Sabbath. In a global Sabbath with the confinement. And it was astonishing. I mean, if you're used to these practices, it's one thing, but for many people, it was a real wake up and awakening sort of thing. And it's very interesting. Stiegler wrote a beautiful, beautiful piece. In French, the lockdown is, of course, the confinement. And he expressed similar hopes. And he spoke back to his own prison experience of being confined, and how that changed his life and made him much more aware of the otium. But again, Rebecca, I don't know, people have short memories. Already, I mean, the vaccine nationalisms that we saw, and you know, the sport is coming back, the Euro soccer and Wimbledon that I also love watching. So I share your hope, but I'm not naive about it.
Here's a one from Martha Reinecke, who writes, Teresa Brennan's Exhausting Modernity and History After Lacan already in 2000 was thematizing acceleration of time and its deadliness. Sadly, she was run over by a car at age 48 and was unable to continue the conversations that Rosa and others had engaged in since that time. Her explanation of the causes of our current existential disease, grounded in Lacan and the lack of being, has strong affinities with Girard's thought.
Thank you very much for that reference, Martha. I will note it. I wasn't aware of Teresa's work. But yeah, I mean, that's, again, I mean, I had to pack so much into this lecture, but that's why I find the way Stiegler has of phrasing modernization is an autocatalytic process, a process of which the execution keeps on speeding the process up. And interestingly enough, he says that for the traditional proletarian, injuries at work, you know, you climb on a ladder, you fall off, you break a leg, or you cut your hand in an accident. But for us new proletarians who sell our attention, injuries at work now is depression, it's burnout. And I think we all probably have it after this 4-day marathon or so.
Yeah.
And not only this, I mean, we all felt it now with the online teaching. And I mean, I ended up wanting to attack my screens. But the point is that this, and I do think, if I can make this very last remark, I'm so glad that Ivan Illich came back into our conference conversations. Yes. I've been prescribing him for years to my students as well. And Illich, in David Cayley's beautiful work of interviews with him, he pleads for a renewed ascesis, and he refers to an ancient monastic practices of averting the eyes. And I find personally, and I'm sure many of you, I've stepped away from audiovisual media. I usually engage only in print media, and your daily swim and your prayer and whatever. That's what keeps you sane, because the fact is what someone has called these merchants of attention. I mean, Tim Wu, I think, is his new book. They in a sense out to get us. So and that's why I think that contemplative practices is the ultimate act of resistance of our time. And the better if we do it collectively, that makes us stronger. Last word for me, Sandra.
Rossouw, Johan, thank you so much for your presentation today. You've given us a great deal to think about. We will now press our appropriate responses. Get it set up there. There we go. We clap to you. You can't hear it, but you can perhaps see it. Yeah, thank you very much. And with this, we will call it the adjournment of the session. Thank you.